very pleased to introduce this, our second panel, the problem of abuse and violence in Catholic theological repair. In this panel, scholars Matt Tapie and Paul Murray will tackle the historical, ecclesiastical, and theological fissures that give rise to human institutional crises and their abuses. I introduced them in reverse, but it's okay. In his paper, Matthew offers a rigorous reading of Aquinas to help adjudicate the troubled history of Jewish-Catholic relations, dealing with the Mortara case of Pope Pius IX's removal of a 6-year-old boy from his family in 1858, after he had been apparently baptized by a Christian housekeeper. Matthew performs an exegetical investigation into multiple deployments of Thomas Aquinas' thought for the sake of arguments both in favor of and against Pius's decision. Most significantly, Matt argues that we need to examine these tense episodes in the history of Jewish-Catholic relations, and that B, to do so, we need the tools of historical critical studies together with the cultivation of moral virtues to respond to the historical critical findings that boldly investigate the episodes themselves. In his paper, Paul discusses the clerical abuse issue and how the recognition of knots, K-N-O-T-S, in institutional epistemologies regarding clerical structure, clerical authority, clerical privilege, challenge us to exercise the best we have to offer in terms of already flawed practices of human reasoning, and to potentially invoke the hope or resource of a divine reasoning. At the heart of Paul's stark encounter with the knots of institutional and socio-political thought is a hope to find truth in the willingness to learn the art of listening to the voices of those subject to the ills of these abuses, a willingness to learn the art of listening as a collective act. Finally, in relation to the last session, Matthew and Paul offer us 2 examples of local problems and problem solving, although we'll consider, are they local? Are they translocal? They both stage experiments in reparative reasoning and ask about the dialectic between the local and the non-finite. That is, they invite us to consider the ongoing value of the pursuit of truth. They ask us to discern whether the pursuit of truth has any role in the resolution of local crises, and if so, what does this pursuit of truth look like? So I welcome, we're going to begin with Paul Murray's talk. So welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Randi, for the introduction. Thanks, Peter, for the invitation. And thanks, Dan and Camille, for making it all possible. So in this conference, we're being invited, each in relation to our own situated particularities of faith tradition, academic expertise, and personal resource, to experiment with Peter Oakes's long-term Persian pragmatist influence project of reasoning for repair, or what the UK philosophical theologian and scriptural reasoner Nicholas Adams well named reparative reasoning. Being English, he would actually say reparative reasoning, but there are some words that just are much better pronounced in American English than, and reparative is very definitely one of them, coffee being another. So I'll start with a few words on my own understanding of reparative reasoning, human and divine, which I offer as a lay Catholic systematic theologian with some pragmatist inclinations. There's a fairly detailed handout, which acts as a kind of crib sheet. There's a shortened version of each point I'm making, and occasionally there is something that is actually worth looking at because there's a quote on it. The notion that the point of reasoning is to help make repair, rather than simply helping us make sense of things, evokes Karl Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it. Reasoning for repair assumes that there are tears, fault lines, and wounds in our relations with ourselves, with each other, and with wider reality, that it is the responsibility of our situated reasoning and reason-informed practice to help diagnose, tend to, and repair, albeit always partially, frequently erroneously, and even disastrously. And as that caveat alludes to, and as each of our faith traditions recognizes, but which human reason on its own generally fails to, the tears, fault lines, and wounds that run through our relating are not simply the result of our practice falling short of our fine ideals and right thinking. Rather, we're dealing with tears, fault lines, and wounds that also run through and distort our reasoning itself, which all too often shares in, compounds, promotes, and reproduces the disfigured falling short of the human condition, the healing of whose ills it's meant to serve. Our reason, even when it is an intentional reasoning for repair, requires the ministry of a higher or deeper reparative reasoning and healing that it can't effect from its own resources. For this, we need Solomon's fated, God-given, charismatic wisdom, and not just confidence in natural human intelligence. We need a divine reparative reasoning. We need the logic and economy of salvation. And this then prompts the question as to what the role of theology is here, to which the first proper thing to say is that whilst theology is the study of God and of all things in relation to God, properly seeks to be informed by and in service of divine reason, it would be idolatrous to assume that theology is divine reason. Howsoever inspired and guided by divine reason and love theology at its best might be, it remains a human activity. Moved by grace, the theologian works always both with feet rooted in the soil of situation, finitude, frailty, and inclination to sin, and with heart, mind, and soul drawn ever beyond to the greater horizon of our calling, hope, and possibility. As such, theological activity is always dependent, always situated, only ever partially fulfilled, and always needing to be returned to afresh and entered into more deeply. It's notable that Anselm of Bex, or Anselm of Canterbury, depending on whether one's allegiances are French or English in this regard, his famous description of theology is fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. It's a transitive phrase referring to something in process, seeking. And if, with pragmatist inclination and spiritual ecclesial orientation, we interpret intellectum, understanding, to encompass wisdom for life and not simply head knowledge, effective knowledge, as Lisa was referring to it, then a less elegant contemporary rendition of Anselm's faith-seeking understanding, and I've got this written on the handout because it is a bit nutty. A contemporary rendition of faith-seeking understanding might be of Christian theology as a process of critical, constructive examination of the understanding and practice of faith and the questions, problems, and possibilities that arise there, with a view to seeking to minister reparatively to the questions and problems in the light of the possibilities, and thereby enhance the quality of the church's understanding and practice and the integrity of its witness. So with that basic understanding of the theological task in mind, which is deliberately broad, and I think actually can encompass all the different ways and modes in which theology tends to be done. But with that broad understanding in mind, we turn now to look at some of the lines along which it might be pursued in the aftermath of the abuse crisis. Working in close partnership with many Catholic organizations and institutions, but situated in a UK research-led public university rather than on Catholic institutional soil. The Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham exists to pursue critical and creative studies of Catholic thought, history, culture, and practice with transformative intent. Key here is what we refer to as a whole church concern to ask how difficult matters can be diagnosed appropriately and responded to effectively in ways that can build consensus across differing perspectives and thereby deepen communion rather than intensifying internal Catholic tensions. Equally, however, given our location in a research-led public university, there's no question that can't in principle be asked and no line of analysis that can't in principle be explored. But the aim always is to examine such issues with rigorous professional expertise and what Frank Sullivan referred to as creative fidelity alike. Now, in light of that context and founding ethos, and following a strong request from our advisory board, since 2011, we've been engaged in various initiatives examining the ecclesial, cultural, and theological implications of clerical sexual abuse and its subsequent mishandling, specifically as these have manifested in the local church in England and Wales. And thus far, there have been three main phases to this work, plus a kind of pre-story phase beforehand. First, in January 2015, we held a multi-constituency seed corn research colloquium, including both victim survivors and offenders, offenders in reform, focused on identifying relevant, viable research projects. Secondly, and in part coming out of that, from September 2018 to 2023, we conducted a 5+ year interdisciplinary empirical research project, Boundary Breaking, that issued in 2 2024 reports, The Cross of the Moment, representing the fruits of the project's major qualitative dimension, and also a second report, Attitudes of Catholics in England and Wales to Child Sex Abuse in the Catholic Church, representing the project's minor quantitative dimension. And there are some complementary copies of The Cross of the Moment available on the side of the room there, should any of you wish to take one. And you'd be doing me a favor because I don't want to have to carry them home to the UK. Then thirdly, since September 24, we've been conducting a further project, Conversion, Culture and Communion, focused on seeking to follow through on the implications of boundary breaking, both by establishing a number of self-reflexive practical initiatives and theological action research projects aimed at promoting cultural change for a healthier church within the Catholic Church in England and Wales, and by examining the possibilities for constructive reparative response to the theological sites and findings of the Cross of the Moment. Throughout these projects, the abuse crisis and its aftermath have been approached as a deep, unhealed wound in Catholic life, most particularly so for victim survivors, but also with significant wider ramifications for all in the Church. A wound, moreover, that has served to bring into sharp tipping point focus some longer-running questions about the health of various aspects of Catholic understanding and practice. And when we were starting out in 2011, the attention being given to the clerical abuse crisis in the Catholic Church in England and Wales was still very much focused on the necessary development of effective safeguarding protocols. The underlying causal factors being considered were confined really to the level of individual dimensions of pathology, wrongdoing, and mismanagement. By contrast, we were influenced by studies such as Marie Keenan's groundbreaking 2011 work, Child Sexual Abuse in the Catholic Church, Gender, Power, and Organizational Culture, in which, on the basis of empirical work in Ireland, with offenders receiving treatment, she argues that the ills exposed by the sexual abuse crisis are not only individual and psychosexual, but also cultural, organizational, and ecclesiological, pertaining to how in Catholic tradition we think about the church and priesthood. Now, I'm aware, of course, that there were other significant studies before that, not least the work Common Calling that Stephen edited in 2004. So taking our lead from this body of work and interested both to test it further and to learn by doing so, our conviction was that we were well placed institutionally to examine the challenging outstanding question as to what the many different dimensions of the crisis and the diverse perspectives of those involved disclose about the collective systemic state of health or disease of various aspects of Catholic ecclesial life and culture in England and Wales, and what the wider implications of this are for all in the Catholic Church. Now, it's important to get some perspective on this. 14 years down the line, with a number of cognate projects having been conducted in other countries, particularly so here in the States and in Australia, with many of them also funded by Porticus International, versions of the Keenan thesis concerning the implications of aspects of Catholic ecclesial culture and ingrained habits of Catholic thought in the circumstances that made clerical sexual abuse at once unthinkable, unacknowledged, unexamined, covered over, and shockingly widespread, have become relatively commonplace in the literature and feature as a regular part of the discourse about the crisis and its aftermath. Most notably, since his 2018 turnaround experience in relation to the Chilean bishop's mishandling of the crisis, Pope Francis has frequently identified clericalism as a contributory cause. But such was not the case in 2011, at least in the UK. The Keenan thesis and those like it were controversial. I'm grateful then that both from 2014, the English Benedictine congregation and the Jesuits in Britain each committed to being full partners, and that following some years of significant resistance, from 2019, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales also agreed to participate. Core then to the boundary-breaking project was the concern to ask after any ways in which Catholic theologies, whether informal and lived or official and taught, can be seen in the context of the abuse crisis to be intertwined with Catholic habits, practices, structures, and norms, and to act as key aspects of how Catholic life and cultures are transmitted, supported, and normalized. The means for doing this was semi-structured one-to-one interviews with victim survivors, with laity and parishes impacted by abuse, and with priests and bishops. Across the interviews, certain deeply rooted habits, practices, and ways of thinking were indeed identified as implicated in the cultures which contributed to occurrences of clerical abuse and the pastoral and legal failings frequently associated with them. In this way, analogous to studies in other parts of the world, boundary breaking furnished corroborating evidence as to where some of the unhelpful knots are in Catholic webs of doctrine, regulatory norms, interpretation, and practice. Knots that unhelpfully stand in the way of some desirable things happening, such as greater accountability for those in authority, and knots that serve to promote and hold other potentially dangerous and damaging things in place, such as an inability to think of the church and its ordained ministers as capable of serious wrongdoing. Most prominent in the analysis in the cross of the moment are the knots of silence and secrecy, of clericalism, understood drawing on the Santa Clara and Fordham Beyond Bad Apples project as a structure of power that sets priests above and apart, granting them excessive authority, trust, rights, and responsibilities. And the knot drawing on Jim Keenan's evocative phrase of hierarchicalism, referring specifically to the combination of very significant power with very little required accountability that particularly pertains to diocesan bishops, and the knot of practices of confession and forgiveness relative to demands of justice, and the knot of understandings of the holiness of the church. Now, given how firmly embedded within and tightly woven into the webs of Catholic tradition each of these knots is, they can't simply be removed or cut out without leaving a ragged-edged hole and likely place of multiple subsequent unraveling. The work of repair needs to be more painstaking, more surgical, more constructive, and more reintegrating than that. To extend the metaphor, such knots need careful unpicking and the constituent threads disentangling, so that whatever is regarded as of essential, lasting significance and vitality can be rewoven in more felicitous, life-giving, redemptive ways, in accordance with the community's best instincts and insights. So with that in mind, we'll now move in to take a closer look at the knot of clericalism. In doing so, we quickly come to see what a complex constellation of compounded knots and multiply tightly interwoven threads clericalism is, bringing into conjunction centuries-long habits of deference, theologies of priestly distinctiveness, normative asymmetries of power and authority, canon law, models of sequestered, cloistered seminary formation, the absence of any required mechanisms of real accountability to the body of the church, and long-established dysfunctional settlements of distribution of time and labor in relation to the internal life of the church. Settlements we need to recognize in which both laity and clergy are complicit and from which each have things to gain. Given this compounded, tightly interwoven reality, if there is to be any effective Catholic cultural change in relation to clericalism, then a holistic approach will be required. There would be little point in focusing on just one of the compounded knots or pulling at just one of the interwoven threads in isolation. A reformed theology of priesthood, abstracted from the established lived realities of Catholic life and culture, will be neutralized and made largely irrelevant by the contrary implicit theologies at work in such things as existing canonical norms about the power of decision-making and the informal curricula of seminary culture. Equally, attempts at purely pastoral reform of patterns of clerical deference, such as declining to use ecclesiastical titles, that leave in place unrevised theologies of clerical distinctiveness and implied superiority, will remain superficial at best, for it's those underlying theologies that provide the ideological justification for the canonically required asymmetries of power and authority that the ecclesiastical titles indicate. Time and again in the course of boundary breaking, and from different actors and perspectives, the interview data attributed the trust that parents of abused children placed in priests, the fact that victims either were not believed or felt they would not be believed, the unaccountable impunity with which abuser priests could act, and the instinct of overseers to protect them. All of this was attributed to the highly elevated way in which priests have been understood. Catholic tradition views priests as distinguished in their being from the non-ordained by being ontologically configured to be a sacramental icon of Christ, an alter Christus. At times, this has been deliberately expressed in extreme contrastive terms that enshrined a strict two-tier understanding of the church, the superior and the inferior. I give you two quotes on the sheet to look at, but I won't dwell on them at the moment, but they are well worth looking at. Now, even when expressed in such distorting terms, I'm referring to as in the two quotes, I suggest that it's important to note that the constructive intent and point of abiding significance here was to seek to maintain something about the identity of the church as being really called to share in and to manifest the holiness of Christ. That was the constructive point behind those really quite distorted and disturbing ways of expressing it. The problem, of course, is that which was intended to support the holiness of the community can be seen in the context of the clerical sexual abuse crisis consistently to have served as a smokescreen and legitimizing ideology, covering over the presence of serious sin and evil in the church's pastoral ministry. Such regular patterns of performative contradiction, or what I label pragmatic incoherence, between what a way of thinking is intended to support and what it in fact supports points to fault lines in the operative ways of thinking themselves that need reparative attention. So the abuse crisis reveals there to be critical fault lines of a dangerous unaccountability and the assumed intrinsic goodness and trustworthiness of the ordained running through and promoted by Catholic theologies of clerical distinctiveness, posing the question as to whether and how they can be repaired with creative fidelity, or what I prefer to refer to as dynamic integrity. As I said earlier, in this case, simple excision, removal is not an option, for in some form at least, an understanding of the distinctiveness of the ordained is baked into Catholic theology, piety, and instincts. And I'm gliding now, for present purposes, over a much, much more complicated and long-running narrative. Let me simply note some key points. At the core of this non-negotiable Catholic instinct for the distinctiveness of the ordained is a conviction that ordained ministry is not simply a function, a task done that can be picked up and put down like a set of vestments. It's the conviction that ordained ministry is a God-given calling that touches the entirety of who the ordained are before God and the community, and that serves to give specific orientation to their baptismal vocation. It shapes their being. This is the point of the traditional language of ontological distinction. The problem, however, is when these attempts to speak of ordained ministry as touching the entirety of an ordained person's being are taken as implying that the ordained are different kinds of beings to ordinary non-ordained Christians. For once lay and ordained are conceived of as different kinds of beings, different kinds of things, then differences of status and the legitimation of dangerous asymmetries of power and accountability all but inevitably follow. How then is the question? How then might we protect theologically against the potentially pathological consequences of the Catholic instinct for ordained distinctiveness whilst preserving what's essential to it? So here's the final section about reweaving the threads of Catholic instinct and understanding with dynamic integrity. Excuse me. One of the most promising constructive proposals for moving beyond this binary has been made by Susan Wood, Rick Gallarde, formerly of this parish, and may the Lord have mercy on him, Ed Hannenberg, and others. Recognizing the need to retain ontological density around ordained ministry in Catholic understanding, they advocate a shift from substance ontology, different kinds of things, to relational ontology, which focuses on how our relationships affect who we are. On this understanding, ordination initiates the ordained into a formal relationship of pastoral leadership vis-a-vis the ecclesial community in a way that gives specific orientation to their baptismal calling and so shapes who they are. I want to say that the basic instincts at work here, those basic instincts being to view ordination as giving specific orientation to the common baptismal calling and to recognize the ontological implications of our formal relations. I want to say that these instincts are to be greatly valued. I also want to suggest there's a limitation in how they go about this. And the limitation I suggest is in the central focus that's placed on active pastoral ministry as the distinguishing relationship. For what does that imply about the distinctiveness of those ordained who, for whatever reason, are effectively not able to serve in pastoral leadership through illness, retirement, or full-time work in a college and that kind of precludes pastoral ministry? What I want to suggest that there's still within the way in which Susan, Rick, and Ed and others have gone about relational ontology, that there is still within it a danger of slippage towards a certain form of functionalism built around active pastoral ministry. As such, a potentially fruitful further development, I suggest, would be to view ordained distinctiveness as primarily consisting in the ordained as being marked out whatever the particular circumstances of their lives, as the official, authenticated, public, sacramental representatives of and witnesses to the prophetic, priestly, and kingly calling and dignity of the community as a whole. This would be to view ordained ministry, diaconal, priestly, and episcopal, as consisting not in an essentially different kind or level of being, but as consisting rather in an essentially different mode of performance of the one and same fundamental baptismal calling, in a way that appropriately distinguishes but does not separate. Now, whilst this proposed reweaving of Catholic teaching about ordained distinctiveness can provide no guarantee whatsoever that ordained and lay, each alike graced but sin-strained, will not continue to fall short of their respective callings, it would serve to remove a dangerous ideological legitimation for regarding the ordained as being different and by implication superior kinds of Christian beings. More than this, far from elevating the ordained over the community, it would provide sure theological grounds in support of the need for their real accountability to the body of the Church, of which they are called to be its visible public representatives and authenticated witnesses, and would provide sure theological grounds also, therefore, for the associated necessary revision of Catholic canon law and normative Catholic structures of governance at parochial, diocesan, regional, and international levels of Catholic life. I suggest, therefore, that in the spirit of turning to that which is achievable, this is an achievable vital repair that's well worth effecting in service of the greater health of the ecclesial body of Christ in the Catholic Church and its witness to divine reparative reason and the economy of salvation, the Latin root of which is, of course, salus, health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your paper and your profound insights. You should have a handout at the table that has some text on it. We'll be running kind of quickly through there. We probably won't have time to read each text, but at least you could perhaps star a text that interests you as we go on the way. The Mortara case refers to Pope Pius IX's removal of a 6-year-old Jewish boy, Edgardo Mortara, from his parents in Bologna, Italy, in 1858. 6 years after the child was born, it was reported that the family's Christian housekeeper had baptized the boy after he had fallen ill as an infant and was allegedly in danger of death. Since canon law and civil law stipulated that a baptized child must be raised Catholic, Pius IX used his power as head of the Papal States to remove the boy. And this painting is actually incorrect because there were no clergy present at the removal according to the archival records. It was just the police of the Papal States. The affair is one of the most painful chapters in the modern history of Catholic-Jewish relations. Edgardo would grow up to become a priest who dedicated his life to teaching the Catholic faith, especially to Jews. The case continues to cause controversy. It is an open wound for the Jewish community, and some contemporary Catholics defend Pius's decision. Other Catholics fear that it provokes anti-Catholic sentiment. There's also popular interest in the case from a 2023 movie entitled Rapito, or Kidnapped, that was produced by the Italian filmmaker Marco Bellocchio. At one point, Steven Spielberg had decided to make a film about the case, although he has since shelved it. The case is also relevant today because the law that served as the basis of Pope Pius IX's 1858 decision is still present in the contemporary Code of Canon Law as an emergency exception. According to the 1983 Code of Canon Law, baptism of adults and infants is administered according to specific liturgical prescriptions. However, in cases of urgent necessity, such as the danger of death, an infant is to be baptized without delay. Normally, for a child to be validly baptized, canon law states that at least one of the parents must give consent. However, Canon 868, Section 2 still has an exception which states that an infant of non-Catholic parents is lawfully baptized in danger of death, even if the parents are opposed to it. To grasp the concern behind the canon, one must first understand the doctrine of original sin and that Christ instituted baptism specifically as a remedy for original sin. Original sin refers, first of all, to the condition in which a person comes into being. It refers to a deprivation of divine life, which manifests itself in the domination of death and the malfunctioning of our desires and emotional life. It is something like a hereditary defect, though sin itself is not a matter of physical structure. In the fall of Adam, all have inherited original sin, and Christ alone possesses the antidote and treatment whereby the person is cured and made healthy through the medicine of baptism. Baptism leaves a permanent spiritual reality on the person. It seals a person with an indelible mark that configures a person to the worship of Christ. A few contemporary scholars defend Pius IX's decision and appeal to this theology of baptism, especially as it is articulated in the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, the famous medieval theologian of the 13th century. They also appeal to the existence of the current canon as well. However, other scholars have criticized Pius IX's decision, also appealing to Aquinas. The entire discussion has overlooked an important fact. The question of how Aquinas' teaching applied to this case was actually at the center of the dispute between the Mortara family and Pius IX in 1858. Indeed, the Mortaras and the Roman Jewish community submitted to the Vatican, with the help of probably a Catholic canon lawyer, to the Vatican a document that appealed to Aquinas to argue that for the return of their child. However, the Vatican's reply denied the request and cited Aquinas' teaching to argue that Edgardo's baptism was valid and that he had therefore belonged to the church. Who had the correct interpretation of Aquinas' thought in this historic case? What is at stake? The topic concerns not only history, but contemporary canon law and open wounds in Catholic-Jewish relations. It also seems that a baptism of a child of non-Catholic parents against their will is in deep tension with the Second Vatican Council's teaching on religious freedom. Does Aquinas' theology support such baptisms and removal of baptized children, or not? The Vatican's official answer is yes. My presentation draws on documents from the archives. First, we will look at the Mortara family's plea, then we will look at the Vatican's reply. My aim is not to evaluate Pius IX's decision, which was legal at the time, but to A, evaluate if the parties in the case interpret Aquinas' theology correctly, and then B, demonstrate why Aquinas' theology provides resources to repair the current canon. I will then share a personal reflection at the end on my approach to this case. The Mortara family's plea quotes Aquinas' greatest work, the Summa Theologiae, which I'll refer to as ST for short. This is in text 1 on your handout. It's also on the screen. And the family appeals to this text to argue that it is not the custom of the church to forcibly convert non-Christians or to forcibly baptize their children. They repeat Aquinas' teaching that since the baptism of an unwilling adult is wrong, so is the baptism of a child against the will of its parents. The family also argued that if such baptisms take place, these are invalid because these lack the intention of the child's parents. A valid baptism requires proper form, intention, and matter. In the family's view, the baptism was not only unlawful then, it was also an invalid baptism. However, the Papal Council's reply to the family also appealed to Aquinas to argue that 1, baptism against the will of non-Catholic parents is indeed unlawful, as in general, as Aquinas and others argued, but this is irrelevant because the Papal Council says there is one emergency exception to this rule that applied to the Mortara case, and that exception is that the Church allows the emergency baptism of children of non-Catholics if the children are near death in order to save the child's soul. The second point the Council argues, contra the Mortaras, is that if a baptism of a Jewish child against the will of their parents take place, it is nevertheless a valid baptism on Aquinas' terms. 3, they also say that it is not necessary that there be an intention to baptize the child in the non-Catholic parents, because a child is not baptized in the faith of their parents, but in the faith of the whole Church. And the Council cites Aquinas' teaching for support in text 4 to argue that the intention of the Church is sufficient. The fourth point the Council addresses is the question of whether the baptized child must be returned to their parents. In reply, the Council answers that the Church's right over a baptized child is a higher right than the parent's right. To prove the point, the Council argues that Aquinas says clearly that the parents would, quote, lose their rights over their children if they are baptized, text 5 on the screen and then also in your handout. The Vatican cites Aquinas again in Secunda Secundae 10.12. This is text 6. The Council also interprets this text to confirm the validity of the baptism and the non-return of the child. The Papal Council's reply indicates that the question of Aquinas' teaching as it relates to the case is more complex than perhaps has been realized. In particular, contemporary scholars who appeal to Aquinas to criticize Pius IX's decision have not addressed text number 6, just cited, which seems to indicate Aquinas thinks parents lose their rights over their children if they have been baptized. Nor have scholars addressed text 3, also from the ST, or from the Summa, that implies that Aquinas thinks that if such baptisms occur, these are valid. Our analysis thus far indicates that 3 questions surfaced in the 1858 exchange. The 3 questions will guide our deep dive into Aquinas' texts. 1a, whether Aquinas' teaching supports the position that Christians can baptize infants of non-Catholic parents against their will for the purpose of saving a child's soul. 1b, the related question of whether the Church's intention suffices for the intention of the non-Catholic parents. 2, whether forced baptism of a child of non-Catholics is nevertheless a valid baptism. And 3, whether non-Catholic parents lose their rights over their children if they are baptized. So we now turn to Aquinas. To untie the knots in this case, we must know how to read Aquinas' articles in the ST. In other words, repairing these problems requires attention to style. As some faculty and students of theology know, the basic unit of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae is a written disputation, meaning based on a classroom disputation. The text is set up as an article, or an articulus. The parts of the article include the question. At the very top there, you can see the question, as well as objections, the sed contra, or the contrary, the respondio, which is the answer, and the replies to the objections. Objections are the list of positions against the answer to the question that Aquinas will adopt. What comes next is the sed contra, or on the contrary. After this comes the respondio, or I answer, and then Aquinas' replies to each of the top objections. The sed contra is frequently misinterpreted because although it is similar to the author's answer, in the next section, the sed contra is not the same as the author's position. It is only in the answer or respondio that the replies to the objections that one can determine Aquinas' answer to a question. That's why I put them in green for go. Now that we have the method of reading down, we can dive into Aquinas' text to answer our 3 questions. The first question of our inquiry concerns the argument of the Papal Council that Christians can baptize children against the will or without the knowledge of non-Christian parents in order to provide them with salvation. Aquinas indeed considers this view, but he lists it as an objection in the Summa Theologiae. As mentioned above in his articles, Aquinas first considers objections or arguments that go against what his answer will be. The objection, or the view opposing Aquinas' answer, is that it would be a sin to not baptize children of non-Catholics, since these children are in danger of spiritual death. These are actual positions that are being floated in the 13th century as proposals. This is text 7. Text 7 is that objection. Again, it's a view against Aquinas' view. Aquinas replies in text 8 to this view he does not like by arguing that one ought to break the order of the natural law. One must not break the order of the natural law in which a child is in the custody of its father in order to provide it with salvation. It should be noted that Aquinas encourages baptism of children in cases of urgency or danger of death, as did many theologians before him. But he forcefully rejects 3 different times in his works proposals for baptism of the children of non-Catholics without parental consent, even to save their souls. After the Christian discovery of the Talmud in Aquinas' age, some thought the task of conversion of the Jews was hopeless, so they began concocting violent strategies. Aquinas explains that the repeated proposals by some of his contemporaries to baptize the children of non-Catholics, it goes against their parents' wishes, are not at all reasonable, and he calls them hazardous. He says it has never been the custom of the church to do so, and it would be dangerous to invent this new strategy. Indeed, Aquinas' arguments won the day on this point, and it wasn't until 1747, around 100 years before the Mortara case, that papal teaching overthrows Aquinas' view and declares that baptism of non-Catholic children is okay if they are in danger of death. In addition to Aquinas' argument that the proposals are against ecclesial law, he also argues it is against the natural law, or the universal moral law established by God to govern creation. Aquinas teaches that a person should only be persuaded to the faith, not forced to baptism by compulsion. Before a child of non-Catholics has the use of free will, it can be baptized only if parents will this. This is text 9. Aquinas then elaborates upon why a child is, before having the use of reason, part of its parents by nature. He says that according to the natural law, a child is by nature not distinct from its parents in 2 ways. Text 10. A child is not distinct from its parents as to its body, so long as it is in its mother's womb. And then, second, later on after birth, before it has the use of free will, it is under the care of its parents, which is like a spiritual womb. Aquinas' use of the spiritual womb metaphor for the care non-Catholic parents give their children indicates his high view of parental rights as an order of divine providence. We will now take up the second part of the first question, 1b, of whether Aquinas teaches that children of non-Catholics can be offered for baptism. Recall that the Papal Council claimed that Aquinas teaches, in text 4, that the children of unbelievers can be brought to baptism by Christians. Does Aquinas teach in text 4 that the representative will of the child baptized is expressed by the church, not by Catholic parents? The question of the article in text 4 is, quote, whether children should be baptized at all. Aquinas considers this in his Summa. The objections reject the practice of infant baptism and answer in the negative with ancient arguments. Quote, children have not the use of free will. They cannot receive baptism. It seems that children cannot be baptized, end quote. The concern of the second objection is worth highlighting, since it is Aquinas' reply to this objection that is cited by the Papal Council against the Mortaras. The concern in the objection is that sometimes children who are baptized happen to be children of non-Catholic parents, but the unbelief in Christ and the parents would seem to harm the child's progress in faith. In reply to the concern that the lack of faith in non-Catholic parents would prohibit the child from receiving the sacrament, Aquinas cites Augustine's words written in letter 98 to Boniface in the 5th century. This is text 4. He argues there that it is not a hindrance to a child's salvation if their parents have no faith. In this particular case, the unbelief of the parents is not a hindrance because the entire community of saints and faithful present the children for baptism. However, the context of Augustine's letter is crucial for making sense of how Aquinas uses the text. The context of Boniface's letter concerns parents who participate in pagan worship in Rome and desire to have their children baptized. Around 408, Boniface reported to Augustine that a baptized child spit out the Eucharist with unusual gestures after having been offered to demons. The parents' participation in demon worship raised the question of whether pagan requests for their children to be baptized should be denied. The concern could be summarized as, what good would it do to allow a child to be baptized and then raised in such an environment? Moreover, why would pagan parents want their children baptized anyway? Augustine's reply to Boniface indicates that parents intended that their children receive baptism. Text 11. The context of Augustine's letter is that the unbelieving parents bring their children to the church on their own accord because they thought baptism would heal their children from sickness or retain good health. And so Augustine's point is that if parents present their children for baptism for the wrong motives, the Holy Spirit still works through the church to bring forth children of God. What is important to note here is that though the pagan parents' intention for baptism of their children was misguided, their intention was for their children to be baptized. Therefore, we can say that Aquinas teaches that the church's intention can of course stand in for the infant children of non-Catholics as it does for Christians generally, but only if non-Catholic parents will their children to receive baptism. The teaching of Augustine cannot be used to justify coercion of Jewish parents. The second question, finally, and each one won't be as long as number one, I promise. We now come to question 2, whether forced baptism of a child of non-Catholics is nevertheless valid. Contra the Mortara family's position, Aquinas does think that if such a forced baptism of a non-Catholic child occurs, it is a valid baptism. We don't have time to discuss why, but Aquinas' thought implies that infants, even if baptized against the will of their parents, receive an indelible character of baptism. So the Papal Council was correct on this point. Question 3. We now consider whether non-Catholic parents lose their rights over their children if they are baptized on Aquinas' terms. Aquinas says that according to the natural law, nothing can be done to children against the will of their parents. However, recall that the Papal Council cited a text of the said contra in text 6 of Aquinas that seems to strongly indicate that Aquinas thinks non-Catholic parents lose their rights of parental authority. The said contra of this article reads as follows, and this is text 6. Quote, now it would be an injustice to Jews if their children were to be baptized against their will, since they would lose the rights of parental authority, ius patriae potestas, over their children as soon as they were Christians, end quote. From a cursory reading of this small part of the article, it seems Aquinas teaches that an unlawful baptism of a child of non-Catholic should result in removal. However, such a misinterpretation of Aquinas' position is due to inattention to the style that we discussed earlier. The said contra can easily be mistaken for Aquinas' own position because the said contra typically represents something close, but not his. It is inadequate on its own since he may only agree with part of it. The argument Aquinas places in the said contra is the preferred argument of the day in the 13th century against forced baptism of Jewish children. The preferred argument is against forced baptism of Jewish children, but it also assumed the consequences that were sometimes applied to coerced but valid baptisms of Jewish children in the 13th century, since it states that parents would lose their rights over their children once their children were baptized. But this is not Aquinas' position. Aquinas' position is similar to the text in the said contra, but it is also different. His position is similar in that he is also against baptizing non-Catholic children against the will of their parents. However, his answer is different in that he establishes the inviolability of parental authority in the order of the natural law. Aquinas' discussion then spells out the consequences of this teaching. Not only is forced baptism of children of non-Catholics contrary to the natural law, but so is taking them away from their parents. He writes in text 12 on your handout, it would be contrary to natural justice if a child, before having the use of reason, were to be taken away from its parents' care, or to have anything done to it if the parents are unwilling. When Aquinas refers to a child being taken away, he uses the same term from his discussion of vices against the virtue of justice in the second part of the Summa, where he explains that deeds that unjustly injure a neighbor include murder, bodily injury, and theft and robbery. In summary, those who appeal to Aquinas to criticize Pius IX's decision have overlooked problematic readings of Aquinas that have been used to justify removal. The critics of Pius IX have not realized that for Aquinas, if such baptisms happened, although unlawful and sinful, these would be valid. However, the defenders of Pius IX have offered deeply misleading arguments that claim that Aquinas' theology supports these unjust baptisms and the removal of the child. The significance of the Mortara family's document that requested the return of their children is that it contains, for us today, through a rereading, Thomistic resources of repair. These resources can help Catholics to rediscover that the act of a forced or clandestine baptism of a non-Catholic child, even in order to save the child's soul, as well as the act of separation, constitute a twofold sin against the parents. And I should add that most contemporary canon lawyers advise against this canon being applied to any non-Catholics. And so it is a bit odd that it still is on the books. There are a few that defend it. As stated above, the current Code of Canon Law states that, quote, an infant of non-Catholic parents is baptized licitly in danger of death, even against the will of their parents. But as we have seen, a child's need for salvation does not justify breaking the natural law. Indeed, even popes, according to Aquinas, do not have the authority to overturn the natural law. Since the premise of the current canon assumes that a child's salvation outweighs the rights of non-Catholic parents in a case of urgency, the canon is in tension with the teaching of Thomas Aquinas. In order for the current canon to be aligned with the Second Vatican Council and Aquinas' teaching on the natural law, it should be modified. In the 1970s, the committee that worked on the reform of the 1917 canon law and sacraments actually decided that the canon should be modified, and they even cited the natural law as a reason. But the committee's work was unfortunately ultimately rejected, and as far as I can see, without sound theological judgment. The reform of this canon remains urgently necessary, since no type of coercion is permitted by Vatican II. It is also an important step along the path of establishing justice between Catholics and Jews today. In this last section of my talk, I want to share a personal reflection on my approach to this difficult topic. When I first read the details of the removal of the Mortara child from his parents, according to the court testimony, it broke my heart. And Lisa, after you shared about the embodied emotions as important responses, I have to say that I remember vividly being on a plane to visit friends in Oregon, and I had trouble after reading the details of the account based on the archival reports of the mother and father. I had difficulty not crying or stopping crying. The study of this history also raised methodological questions for me. How does one obtain an accurate account of the facts of political, legal, and religious history? How should a Catholic approach questions about difficult periods in the history of Catholic-Jewish relations, especially as these relate to one's own tradition? I found that some of these questions were addressed by the Catholic Church in the 1999 document, Memory and Reconciliation, the Church and the Faults of the Past. This rich document, somewhat overlooked, was proposed by Cardinal Ratzinger in view of the Jubilee year 2000, and it provides guidance today, Jubilee 2025, on the above questions. On the question of how one obtains an accurate account of the facts of history, Memory and Reconciliation states that understanding the evidence of the past means reaching it as far as possible in its objectivity through all the sources that are available. This means that obtaining an accurate account of a certain period requires that one consider the work of multiple historians and take documentary evidence seriously over perhaps a memoir. The Commission teaches that once facts have been established, it is necessary to then, quote, evaluate their spiritual and moral value. This is especially the case when one is evaluating events in the history of Catholic-Jewish relations, since, quote, the relationship between Christians and Jews is one of the areas requiring a special examination of conscience, end quote. This introspective approach implies that there is a moral theological dimension to the study of these topics. From a Catholic perspective, this means that evaluation of events or crises in our era or in the past requires the cultivation of virtues. Indeed, the authors of Memory and Reconciliation even teach that the truthful analysis of difficult periods can be considered an act of, quote, courage and humility. The virtue of prudence is crucial in this sort of inquiry. Prudence does not mean being cautious or careful. In the Catholic tradition, prudence is the cardinal virtue that allows us to act according to a truthful grasp of the way things are around us, as opposed to the vice of cunning. The cunning person deliberates about action not in accordance with reality, but in accord with one's own interests. That is, the way things are warped to fit what one wants. During my sabbatical in 2023, I met with 2 librarians in Bologna who had published a helpful website that contains digitized sources from the Mortara case. When I realized that their research also identified some of the locations in Bologna where important events from the case took place, I decided to visit the approximate location where the Mortara home once stood, at Via del Lame 8. The apartment is no longer there, but this is approximately the street where it would have happened. After visiting the street, I walked just 15 minutes through Piazza Maggiore, the city's main square, to the Basilica of San Domenico. This church administered the order to have the child removed from his parents. On the night that the police came to the Mortara home, Edgardo's father made a similar trip from his apartment to San Domenico to request a stay in order to remove his son. The Basilica of San Domenico contains the remains of St. Dominic, founder of the Order of Preachers, Thomas Aquinas' order. As I explored the basilica, I entered a side chapel that contained a painting of St. Thomas by Giovanni Battista Bertuzio, 1577 to 1644. It was titled St. Thomas with the Virgin and Saints Peter and Paul. I couldn't help but be struck by the contrast of Aquinas' thought in relation to the actions that took place. I was reminded of the towering significance of Aquinas' theology for the Dominicans and the Catholic Church. As I left the basilica, I lit candles for the Mortara parents, Momolo and Mariana, and for Edgardo. In Rome, I also met with a descendant of the Mortara family, Elena Mortara. Elena is the great-granddaughter of Edgardo's older sister, Ernesta Mortara. Elena's great-grandmother, Ernesta, was 11 years old when she witnessed the removal of her younger brother, and she was haunted by the events until the end of her life. Hearing from Elena that the case was an open wound for her family, which they still discuss at each Passover, filled me with a steady motivation to write a book-length study on this case, and then theological knots at its center. Thank you for your patience.
I don't have any fancy PowerPoints, but I'm going to thank Peter for inviting me, and Dan and Ruth for sponsoring the event with the Corcoran Chair. I will give 4 brief considerations in response to Matthew's paper, and then 4 to Paul's. Matthew's paper raises for me several points. First, theological and doctrinal developments beginning in the middle of the 19th century regarding the meaning of creation, original sin, and salvation, and especially pertaining to the universal presence of divine grace in the life of every human being, carries massive implications for Christian-Jewish relations. The presupposition of the Mortara kidnappers was that an unbaptized child will be eternally prevented from entering into the beatific vision. We don't believe that anymore, at least not here at Boston College. So I think, of course, it's important to change the canon that's on the books. Matthew persuades me about that, but it seems to me that the canon is an answer to a question theologians don't take seriously anymore. And I wonder if that's the case. It seems to me, but I'm a moral theologian, a humble moral theologian, not a systematic theologian, so maybe Paul would talk about that. Secondly, Matthew's analysis focuses on a case in which the Thomistic emphasis on natural law provides or natural right, language in one of these texts, provides a strong basis for offering moral criticism of specific injustices committed by Catholic authorities, including doctrinal injustices in the Mortara case. Martin Luther King Jr. once famously quoted Augustine and Aquinas in his letter from a Birmingham jail to the effect that an unjust law, one that violates the basic moral norms of the natural law, or I would even call it human decency, is no law at all. I think that's one of the rich sides of Catholic moral theology. The natural law can be used as a criterion for judging interpretations of morally problematic situations. The notion of basic moral law, or simple human decency, as I've said, continues to be critically important to our own world today. I think of the children, as I was reading Matthew's paper, I thought of the children who were taken every day by human traffickers. I thought of the separation of children from their parents at the border, US-Mexico border. And I think about and worry about the 19,000 children stolen by the Russians and deported to Russia from Ukrainian families. This profound natural right is never brought up by apologists from the Catholic tradition for the Trump administration, and for that matter, earlier administrations had done the same thing. Thirdly, Matthew's presentation reminds us that the high esteem with which Aquinas held the truth, reminds us of the high esteem with which Aquinas held truth. Veritas is the motto of the Dominican order, and is reflected in the fact that his great masterpiece, the Summa Theologiae, takes as its fundamental unit the question and not the thesis statement. The Summa has as its goal raising questions to provide understanding, but that understanding is to help us guide our lives, communally and individually. So I think there is very much of a pragmatic dimension of Thomas's theology, or at least certainly pragmatic implications, underpinnings. Teloi. Such a goal was sought communally in extended conversational engagement that was the medieval disputation. In our post-truth age of alternate facts, fake news, and outrageous bold-faced lies, we need to affirm this Thomistic commitment to the process of raising and seeking to answer questions of truth, especially when doing so causes discomfort. And many times I've experienced in university settings an aversion to the word truth and substituting for it the word knowledge for various reasons of deconstructionist theology, philosophy, etc. So I want to praise that Matthew's paying attention to the drive for truth in Aquinas' own theology and not allow that to be thwarted by ecclesiastical pressure. Fourthly, this commitment to truth not only supports, but actually requires Christians to engage in practices, something like reparative reasoning. We best seek to fulfill our responsibility to seek out and adhere to the truth as best we can make it out when we do so with a keen awareness of the real limits of our own understanding, where the word our refers to our communal as well as individual epistemic shortcomings, particularly those based in bias, suspicion, and hostility, sprinkled over with an air of condescension. The countless historic sins of Catholics against Jews require Catholic participants in such a dialogue to proceed in the spirit of openness, curiosity, humility, and repentance. Such reasoning has to be done despite the fact that institutions and communities with perceived vested interests often prefer self-exonerating reasoning over really reparative reasoning. I'll now turn to Paul's paper. Paul's paper on reparative reasoning and responding specifically to the clerical sexual abuse revelations promotes truth-seeking and honestly confronting the rationalizing and epistemically biased tendencies built into clericalist ecclesial culture and ingrained habits of Catholic thought. Our patterns of reasoning are rooted in our habits of mind and heart, and these in turn reflect the communities and institutions of which we are a part. In general, I agree with Paul's approval of my late friend Rick Gallardi's relational ontology, but I wonder if ontological still isn't too abstract. As a Christian ethicist, I am interested in the concrete moral and social implications that come with a healthy and mature theology of the laity, as well as theology of the ordained. As Paul mentions, baptism brings with it a universal call to holiness. And it makes sense, as he does, to say that ordination is marked by a special commitment to pastoral ministry. But the complexity, of course, is twofold. One is that the laity often do as well in pastoral ministry as the clergy does. I think of the many amazing religious sisters I've known in my life who were never, of course, not ordained. They're in the lay state. But I also think this point can be elaborated by distinguishing between formal and informal forms of pastoral ministry and pastoral effectiveness. Many of those who are formally charged to play the representative role do not do so as effectively as many lay people who, in ministries of compassion and justice, present the face of Christ more effectively. Let me offer four brief reflections in response to Paul's presentation. First, I think Christians in general and Catholics in particular ought first to go through a long process of quietly listening to both Jews and to victims of sex abuse, respectively. Doing so would provide a more informed context for ongoing reparative reasoning, both within the church and between the church and non-ecclesial interlocutors. One way to promote listening that I have experienced as successful is through practices of restorative justice. A few archdioceses and dioceses have sponsored restorative justice practices in this country, Ireland, Australia, abroad, as well as other places. The point is to allow victims, in these cases primarily secondary victims, to have a structured opportunity to speak their truth and for institutional representatives to listen to them with respect and empathy. Healing circles provide a context for conversations about reparations as well, as expressed by those who are the victims, rather than planned out by lawyers and accountants. Some archdioceses and dioceses, notably in the upper Midwest and West Virginia, have run successful pilot programs in a number of parishes. But most archdioceses and dioceses have shown no interest in this path. As of 2024, the church has paid approximately $4 billion in this country to victims of clerical sex abuse, or sex abuse in the church. Most bishops seem just to want to move on. Their sentiment seems to be, we've paid a lot of money in damages, what more do they want? But what they want isn't material. Secondly, to continue my comment on Paul's paper, formal seminary education needs to take Christian-Jewish relations and history much more seriously. All seminary formation, I used to teach 3 years, I taught in the Catholic seminary before I came to Blessed Boston College. All seminary formation, in my opinion, should require some kind of serious, concrete engagement with a synagogue or Jewish academic center, so that future priests would be encouraged to develop not just passing acquaintance, but real friendship with peers from Jewish communities. Friendship can facilitate reparative reasoning together in a spirit of parity, mutual respect, and solidarity. To participate in this kind of community of dialogue, seminarians in this context must drop the assumption, which I believe is very strongly drilled into them, that they must speak for their church rather than as someone thinking from within their church. Thirdly, sexuality, sex, and gender are deeply implicated in both of our topics, though in very different ways. That is, in both the Mortara case and the wider question of clerical sex abuse. It bears repeating that the first priority of any Christian community engaged in reparative reasoning ought to be to listen to victims, and this includes female as well as male survivors. There is a deep psychosocial connection between priests abusing boys and young men, and sometimes young women, and sometimes adult women, and a clerical culture that regards male alone as uniquely able to act in persona Christi, uniquely qualified to represent the whole church, and in fact, by implication, as uniquely suited to represent God Almighty. A closely related point is that, like it or not, Catholic institutional leaders sooner or later have to face the fact that what Paul calls the ontological conception of separation is received by many bright, mature, ethically serious young women and some of their male friends who I teach as sending a disrespectful, subordinationist, insulting message to women, whether that's intended and felt or not. More and more of them will have none of it. The church thus also has to take responsibility not only for repairing the damage done to direct and indirect victims of sex abuse, but also for repairing the damage done to women as a whole by our pervasively male-dominated institution and ecclesial culture. I think all of us will agree that reparative reasoning is necessary, but not sufficient. The church must change not only the behavior and governance structures of the church, not only its theological argumentation, but also its sensibilities, attitudes, and internal culture, all of which shape the way we think. Finally, it is worth noting that both anti-Semitism and clerical sex abuse are obviously not only challenges in the US, but also to many other settings around the world. The church has not fully acknowledged the institutional as well as personal sin of sex abuse as a pervasive problem for the global church. The Catholic Church needs to establish uniform norms for all Catholic institutions around the world and establish some kind of ombudsman for monitoring their compliance. If the church wants to learn anything profound from this catastrophe, if it wants to find a way to heal what Paul calls the deep, unhealed wound in Catholic life, then it must follow St. Paul's advice to the Church of Rome when he writes, "Be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And where the transformation of mind of this sort reflects and stimulates a wide and profound change of Catholic habits, practices, structures, and norms. Thank you.
Open it up to questions.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm Vanessa Oakes, University of Virginia. Last year, I was teaching rabbinical students at Hebrew Union College, and I was paying attention to a ritual that they had instituted last year to give new diplomas to those former rabbinical students whose smicha documents, ordination documents, contain the names of individuals who it was later discovered were abusive in some ways in their institutions. And the institution created not only documents, but rituals as well. For what do you do when you receive your document? What do you do when you open it up? What do you do when you hang it on the wall? and brand new, if people wish, new ordination ceremonies. So I'm curious to know, other than the ritual of paying damages, I'm curious to know how the Catholic Church has been ritualizing responses to abuse, and how individuals who have been abused, how they've received those rituals. And I want to thank Professor Pope so much for your response.
Thank you for the question. It's not very often that Catholics are saying we need more rituals after Vatican II. But I think we have not ritualized. The way it's been, the people that I know that have found the most solace, victims that I know found the most solace, have found that in interpersonal meetings with other victims who were organized by non-official church practices. I do know that there have been individual priests and individual bishops that have met with victims, and those that have met with them honestly and with humility and repentance have been able to have a positive impact. There are more bishops that just don't want to deal with it. I think we're just gonna be quiet and let's all just move on and things will be fine. And the beauty, part of the beauty of, to my mind, the beauty of the Catholic tradition is precisely its ability to ritualize powerful moments that can't just be reduced to language, formulas that are more powerful than in just individual one-on meetings. It can be very important. But I think I'm taking what you're saying as calling for more intentional ritualization, or specifically for people that are in abuse. I think that's a very good idea, in my opinion. Yeah, Paul, you can.
Thanks, Vanessa. So a few different things occur to me. One is, the Catholic tradition has deep traditions and practices of individual confession, albeit somewhat falling out of use in many times now. It's often struck me that what we don't have is well-developed practices of collective repentance, which that should be part of the Lenten practices, for example. Regardless of the sexual abuse crisis, that's something we kind of need in the tradition to be doing more effectively. But in the context of the sexual abuse crisis, it's absolutely crucial that we do something like that. There was an attempt sometime during the Benedict papacy. There was a call for a day of repentance because of the sexual abuse crisis. And I have to say, I thought it was incredibly badly handled. I mean, this was at a time, this was a boundary-breaking project, is trying to say that all in the church are implicated. And I think that's right. At the time when Benedict called for this, it was at a time when there was a huge amount of denial on behalf of the church of quite how significant this was in terms of the ecclesial cultural fabric of it. And the way in which, the bishops needed to take a lead. Bishops needed to take a lead about what did it mean to take responsibility. That's not to say that the bishops are the only actors implicated in this, but they needed to take a lead because they hadn't taken a lead in managing it properly. And when this was played out, this day of repentance, what needed to happen was seeing the bishops prostate and inviting the church to follow in that movement. There was no symbolic leadership of that sort taken. It was presented onto the church. we need to all own this and pray for it. And the church was traumatized by it. You know? Much more positively, I don't know whether this is an international thing. I think it's meant to be an international thing. A day of prayer for victim survivors is now becoming routinized. And that's certainly happening in many parishes. It should be happening in every parish. It's happening in many parishes in England and Wales. And that is taking more the right note of it's placing the victim survivor at the heart of this acknowledgement, and from that taking out the invitation for us to own it as a whole body of church. On the cover of the Cross of the Moment report is a fence with some ribbons on it. This is an interesting informal liturgy that has actually gathered quite a lot of pace. And it was the initiative of a victim survivor in the north of England. And actually some people she lives in a village up in Cumbria, quite a remote part. And some people from the local Church of England, the Anglican parish, Episcopalian as you'd say over here, they must have known something of her story. There was abuse occurrence in the parish. They were traumatized by it. They didn't know what to do about it. They came to our colleague and she said, well, we need to pray this through, and we need to pray this through publicly. Why don't we start tying ribbons on the fence of the church and invite people to join us in doing this? And it was also an opportunity where people would engage them in conversation. What are you doing? What are you doing here? And the victim survivor experience is at the heart of it. This has gone viral. I mean, she's in the States in various places. It's completely unfunded, unstaffed. But she's going off to Australia. It's caught a moment, you know, and it's that need for ritualization. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely on the money with that.
Just a follow-up to Vanessa's really helpful comment, throughout a lot of this, I keep thinking about Appleby's book on conflict resolution, and the extent to which a science of conflict resolution and practices of conflict resolution are so important in terms of reparative activity. What's remarkable about Appleby's book is that he takes data on what actually works in terms of reparative experience for people, and he provides a kind of stand back analysis, a kind of pragmatic review of it, and says, well, this would be a good hypothesis for how we can proceed. But he asks questions of what are the conditions of the possibility of forgiveness? What are the conditions of the possibility of truth and reconciliation committees, so on and so forth. So I think that, anyway, I think there's a whole arena moving out of your direction, which concerns ritualization practices and trying to establish the conditions so that the conflicts both don't arise. Anyway, it's a complex thing. My question is directly for you, Paul. You talk about the relationship between university committees who are doing certain kinds of work on analyzing the problems that you're seeing, and you assess the extent to which those university committees can identify the knots, if you will, in the discourse and in the logics and in the habits that are being performed in these clerical institutional settings. And I just want to ask what I consider to be the really important question. There tends to be, when we engage in these kinds of analyses, a little bit of an us-them kind of positioning, where there is a kind of self-understanding of we're engaging in the moral virtues, we're engaging in the position of critique, and we're establishing that those who are perpetuating these problems are caught in ideological discourses that they refuse to break themselves out of. And I just want to ask you whether or not, it seems to me that it's rather important to recognize that being entrapped into ideological habits of thinking is also a functional response to a set of crises. To what extent do those of us who are in the position of trying to repair require that we actually begin to consider diagnoses of what are the levers by which ideologies are perpetuated, and what are we going to do about them? And the fact of the matter is that it's naive for us to think that we do not also fall prey to a whole host of ideological habits, that is to say, knots. And if we're going to actually engage in critique, we also have to engage in self-critique. But my point is that we have to understand the functionality of ideological refusals to engage in reparative reasoning. What role do you think that kind of diagnosis plays? Is that a necessary element in any larger project of reparative reasoning?
Succinctness was not one of the gifts I was given, sadly, but I will do my best. So in terms of, when I was talking about the situatedness of the theologian and trying to say, you know, look, we need to, the medicinal imagery, the surgical imagery can only take us so far, because where that unhelpfully takes us to extend the metaphor, so the theologian becomes the consultant surgeon on this ailing body that is other than the theologian. And the theologian, of course, is situated in the institutional soil of academia where we think correct thoughts, yeah? So in trying to allude to that, it was not just trying to say, look, yeah, carry on with that, but just be a bit more humble about it. It was, so to play with David Tracy's kind of different publics. You know, the theologian, the soil that the theologian is situated in is the soil of those three publics at once. And if the theologian, I think I would want to say, if the theologian is not really situated in the soil of community, of practice and faith, then, you know, it might be a form of study of religion that they're doing, but I'm not sure it's a kind of constructive theological activity. And if they are situated in the soil of religious community, I'd want to go further and say, actually, I think that's the primary situation. The academic and institutional might enable them to do things that you can't do as easily in a seminary context. And I've worked in a seminary context, and there are things you can do in a seminary context you can't do in a public university, actually. But you know, there are questions that you're not encouraged to ask and pursue. So for all the kind of you have space to do some of this work, it needs to be done with a sense of not looking at the body, but being in and of the body. And all that runs through the body runs through the theologian. So I do think there is the need for self-reflexivity. And that kind of phrase I referred to as whole body stuff, that's kind of really important in terms of that mentality, I think, of trying to say, this is not going to trying to go light on the clerical aspects of the church, but equally it is absolutely not trying to say it's only the clerical aspects of the church that are involved in this. The whole church is in various ways. And as to those points of resistance, what do we do with that? So this third project that we're in the early stages of at the moment is not a dissemination project. There is dissemination work going on. This project is not primarily the vehicle for that. This vehicle is, on the one hand, trying to develop models of good practice of how we might effectively move forwards in some aspects of cultural change. When I said about being self-reflexive theological action research projects, the self-reflexive thing is trying to get at where are the things that make this difficult? Where are the things that make this difficult? And again, it's not where are the things that make this difficult in them? Where are the things that make this difficult in the fibers, the instincts, the habits that we are all part of? Yeah. And what kind of progress can we make with that? I just don't think it's our responsibility to sort out everything. You know, I think it's our responsibility to do what we can. And as we kind of run at the horizon kind of expands, and finding one possibility opens up another possibility and another possibility. And that other possibility wasn't possible without dealing with this possibility. Yeah? I'm a pragmatist.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts, and there may be a bit of a question in this, but we were in South Africa in the summer of 2016, and for almost a month, and towards the end of that trip, went to the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, which pretty much ends this massive museum with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And yet our entire experience of South Africa was that truth and reconciliation had not really been achieved. That this is something which was, they had a communication and they said, okay, good, it's done. But the reconciliation itself really hadn't happened, and hadn't happened in a deep way. And I think that is a message in some ways for the kinds of things that we're talking about. I happen to be aware of a case of clerical abuse that was happening this year in Boston. That's not done. And Matthew, I think it was you we turned to for studies in Christian-Jewish relations when we needed some articles that related to the Mortara affair. I can't date exactly what year that was, but what spurred that off was the publication of Mortara's diary in Italian, and it's coming out in English as well. And the person who was sponsoring that locally here was not at Boston College, but he was across the street, not at our seminary, but at St. John's Seminary. So this is still, all these things are still very, very local. And then the other piece that just what Vanessa's talking about brings to mind, not that we should force victims of abuse to be confronted by their abusers, but there's a very strong tradition in Judaism that somebody's being forgiven for their sin requires them to have created peace between them and the person they sinned against. And I think that the ability to turn to a third party is somehow or other, from my perspective, sort of avoiding the process of reconciliation and of really getting to the heart of these issues. Obviously, when we're dealing with historical cases, that's no longer an issue, but people are still living this. People are still celebrating this. And of course, the clerical sex abuse continues.
Because you mentioned the memoir that was published by the Italian historian Missori, we should just note for anyone listening that there's a new version of the memoir that's now published. It's only in Italian, unfortunately. Hopefully it will be translated into English, but it is based on the accurate version, the correct version of the memoir. It's not doctored as the Missori version.
I can make a quick comment. I can talk to you in the hall more. But I would say the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was a context, primarily a context for victims to speak. It's called narrative truth by Tutu, and that was valuable. They report that having been valuable, but there was not follow through. That was a huge problem. And that problem was not created by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was lack of leadership from the Mbeki regime, and then Zuma, even worse. Mbeki wanted to move on again. It does underscore how difficult real reconciliation is. And the fact that it's usually imperfect, partial, but at least to be able to have respectful relations that's truly reconciliatory requires those who have been wrongdoers to repent of their wrongdoing. The TRC did not ask that of those who spoke. Some did voluntarily repent. Many did not. Their refusal to say anything more than we were following orders, we all know where that comes from, that gave more pain to the victims. Focusing on our question, I think what that implies for me is there has to be a lot more repentance on the part of the Catholic Church, both for anti-Semitism and clerical sex abuse. It takes a lot of courage to repent. The other thing I would like to add is that the Catholic Church has some good, large, high-level documents. But there hasn't been enough effort to put them into practice on the parish level, on the university level, on the school level. As if it's enough to say, the Pope says, you know, we apologize. And I think that that's sufficient. That's really the start, not the end of the process. And it's not just, it can't just be top level. It has to be something that gets into the bones. It really has not.
Okay, I'll keep this one short then. Jason Welly, I teach here at Boston College. Two-part question for Paul. First, I appreciate the framework of the knots. You've got me thinking about Pope Francis and the image of Mary, the untire of knots. So I think it's an apt image. First, I want to know if I heard you right. It seems to me that this shift from substance ontology to relational ontology is a disproportionately bigger knot in impeding repair, as you have framed this problem. Perhaps it's not the Gordian knot, but it's a much more serious one than others. And so basically, I want to know if I heard you correctly or not. Second, I want to raise a question about the Munera Christi, the priest, prophet, king framework in relation to the sacrament of holy orders, because I found myself wondering that even if we were to shift to a more relational ontology in the understanding of priesthood, we'd still have the problem where a layperson would not have legal power over a cleric except by virtue of a derogation from the law, as is the case right now. If a layperson were heading a Vatican dicastery, or if a lay member of a clerical institute were elected superior, they still only possess that power by exception. And so I wonder if there's anything that needs to be revisited about the Munera Christi framework in this regard. And thank you.
Thanks, Jason. So the first one, absolutely. I don't see relational ontology as in itself a problematic knot. I do see substance ontology as a problematic knot in this context. Yeah. Are some knots more difficult than others? Yeah, I guess so. And but because some things are more firmly embedded, some things more entwined within them, and you can't kind of do a typology of it all. We do it on a case by case basis because it's nor are they abstracted from context either. Yeah. In terms of the Munera Christi. The threefold office. So what I was doing in relation to priestly office, presbyteral ministry, I was just alluding to that similar moves can be made in relation to diaconal as service and episcopal as particularly associated with the kingly or the governance. Yep. Now, it's clear in, say, Vatican II teaching that it's not exceptional to speak of the laity as sharing in the munera of service. It's not exceptional to speak of the laity as involved in the priestly munera. So, parents so the diaconal parents are the first teachers. That's established Catholic teaching of the faith. Parents, lay people in extremis, is that a form of, to take one example, can baptize. Governance is the one that is ring-fenced, right? Ring-fenced and protected. And following through on the implications of this, if it was done at all three levels, it eradicates the legitimation or canon law keeping in place that distinction. So I've got a lot of priest friends, and I am interested in the phenomenon of the Vatican II priest, who is about 10 years older than me, or so, could be a bit older than that, you know, who's self-understanding, and it's not just self-understanding and it's an illusion, it's real. You know, the Catholic cosmos is shaped by Vatican II and the kind of fundamental shifts, and you know, the collaborative ministry, they don't get worked up about that. What's not to like? You know, of course, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do the baptism program. What's not to like about collaborative ministry, you know? And of course, we've got a parish council. And, it's very, very consultative, and we get all the big issues out there. Those same priests, and it's happened with more than one, and I don't mean in a situation of aggression or something, but, something sharp comes up. I'm intrigued by the way in which they resort to canon law as actually what goes somewhere deeper in them than the Vatican II theology. And a phrase like, just remember, it's me who's got the power, or a kind of slightly less assertive and a sort of more worried version of that is, look, you don't understand. I'm the one where the book stops, and I'm the one who's going to be made responsible. Yeah? Basically two sides of the same issue. So, yeah, I agree.
Five. I'll be super fast. Yes. So one of the things that, Paul, your reflections made me think about is, also, I'm Kieran, I'm a Jesuit in formation here at Boston College. And it made me think about, especially your discussion on the sort of different approaches to the ontology of the priesthood. It made me think about the vow formula that I took when I became a Jesuit. And at the very end of our vow formula, we have the line, as you have freely given me the desire to make this offering, so also may you give me the abundant grace to fulfill it. And I'm wondering how, what is the potential for an approach like that both sort of recognizes the goodness of the desire there and the continued need to cooperate with grace in living out that desire, how that sort of dynamic can be expressed or applied when considering a theology of ordination, and maybe sort of more broadly for the Catholic Church when considering who we are as a church, and in sort of engaging in both sort of trying to hold on to the goodness that is there while recognizing the harm that we have done historically.
Thanks. That's I resonate with what you're asking, and in a couple of ways. One, as a religious, you may have been thinking, a lot of what he's saying sounds to me like how we religious understand ourselves, whether we're ordained or not. And you'd be on the money to think that, yeah? Because there's something about the public visibility role of religious in the church as vowed religious. And there's something in what I'm saying about how would be fruitful for us to develop relational ontology further. So it's a mode of performing that which we all do, a more visible mode. In Catholic language, a sacramental mode. I'm actually wanting to understand ordination and what it does relative to the body of the church in an analogous way that we're already comfortable in understanding what vowed religious life is. Okay, now, that wasn't exactly your question, but you might be interested to know that as a vowed religious. In terms of, I really like what you just said there, and the Ignatian Suscipe and the Take Lord, which is so often used in ordination services. All of that's important, and I'm interested in the resonance between the occasionalism in the Lutheran tradition and something that I think is quite important in the spirituality of grace in Ignatian tradition, and where the point of connection there is in the constant dependence on it. Okay? So not taking it that, you know, ordination kind of gives the ordained this super backpack, yeah? And that super backpack is a thing given, which is there and can kind of be sort of rested into and taken for granted, as it were. In parentheses, if you think that's kind of an inappropriate caricature, think of the number of people who, running up to ordination or after ordination, are thinking that this is really going to change me. Those wrinkles in my life are going to get ironed out by this. Yeah. But instead thinking of this as something that needs to be constantly lent into afresh and constantly received afresh. Breath in, breath out. Breath in, receive. Breath out, lean in. So yes, I resonate with that.
He's the water.
Matt, I was so moved and interested in the way you integrated this detailed study of canon law with theology, with emotion. I'll just ask a little question just to have you open up and talk about something to do with those three. I'll just do that. Could you talk about those three together?
It's a very interesting question. I guess, you know, I have a sense of my vocation is probably there, you know, present in combination of those things. As a theologian, but also a person who is involved in trying to encourage mutual understanding between Catholics and Jews quite on a regular basis. And I find that it is something that is deeply personal in many ways. You often have, you know, relationships with people in the community, relationships that you are developing over time, and I think the trust that's needed to cultivate a relationship is a trust that only comes when people are genuinely themselves. And I think that for our interreligious relationships to be genuine, they have to involve self-examination of our stories and our backgrounds. And this, maybe an analogy would be in the same way that I would go to confession. It takes an examination of conscience. You know, did I speak harshly to someone? Was, you know, and believing in original sin, that's a real thing that I'm impacted by on a daily basis. And so maybe, you know, there's doctrine there that's kind of like dogma embedded in me that lives out. It's in different ways. And the emotion, I think, was just probably a personal, I remember at the time my daughter was about 6 years old, or I think actually 5. And as to try to understand the story better, I have to admit, my imagination sometimes can run wild, and I did imagine, what it would be like to have somebody knock at your door and ask for your child, and then take your child. And I think that being empathetic in interreligious dialogue is also getting into people's shoes, trying to see the world from their view and see the world from the open woundedness that's there. So, so that's a scattered array of thoughts that come when I think about emotion and my interest in canon law and theology. And, I think that reflection on canon law and theology and asking questions is what we're doing here, as Stephen pointed out, with the questions of the Summa. So I think that there's an important faith-seeking understanding that we're on the way trying to discern and understand how theology is informative for us and deeply formative for us, but also can be used in ways that justify injustices. And so theology's proximity to power, is an interesting thing there too. Thank you for listening.
Thank you all very much. That really was great conversations, and I think both of our panels have been bearing the fruit of the soil that Peter watered in preparation. We are going to adjourn for the evening. There's a reception out front, and then dinner here in about half an hour or so for guests. We come back tomorrow at 9 a.m. And we begin our next panel at 9:30. I look forward to talking further. Thank you all.